Good morning. I'm Raleigh Flynn, president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank and a registered 501c3 based in Philadelphia. We're committed to bringing the highest scholarship and expert analysis to you on the topics of international affairs and national security. We have a great program this morning. We're going to talk about the complex and ever fascinating topic of Iraqi politics. Before I forget to do so, the most important thing is to also thank our members and partners for your generous support. We couldn't do this without you, and we are most appreciative. A couple of housekeeping matters. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you will see a button that says chat. If you click on that, you'll have something come up on the right where you can add questions, because we will have a Q&A at some point in this morning's discussion. And so put your questions in there. We'll be monitoring them and asking as many as we have time for. So before further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Erin Stein, who wears many hats for FPRI. He's our Middle East Program Director. He's our Acting National Security Program Director, and he's also the creator and moderator of our Middle East Brief. He has a BA in politics from the University of San Francisco, an MA in international policy studies from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, and he did his PhD in the Middle East and Mediterranean Studies at King's College London. He's a prolific writer and contributor to lots of different publications. So I'm pleased to turn it over to Erin.
Thank you, Raleigh, and thank you for the kind words, and thank you everybody for joining. Just my own housekeeping at the outset, as we all are recording or at least tuning in from our houses. My house is full of children under 5, so if you hear screaming or crying, trust me, their mother is with them, and everything will be okay. I promise you that. I have not left my children unattended, but I cannot account for them being quiet the entire time. And with that, further ado, I wanted to get into the program here. We have a very special panel today that's brought in collaboration with the DT Institute, a not-for-profit organization that pushes the boundaries of peace and development in 3 principal areas: stabilization and transition, economic growth and environment, and independent media and technology. Our cross-collaborator from DT Institute, John DeBlasio, will co-moderate a moderated discussion after our 2 panelists finish some introductory remarks. Our 2 panelists are 2 of the authors that have contributed to a joint FPRI and DT Institute edited volume titled Iraq and Transition, Competing Actors and Complicated Politics, the link of which I will put into the chat box if anybody is interested in diving deeper into the edited volume. And it's something that I would encourage everybody to check out. And finally, just to introduce our 2 panelists, I will do so in reverse order of how they will speak. The first is Renad Mansour. He's a senior research fellow and project director of the Iraq Initiative at Chatham House. And he is also a senior research fellow at the American University of Iraq, Suleimani. And we have Ina Rudolf, who is a research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence, and is pursuing her PhD studies at King's College London, and is also has an affiliation at the Candide Foundation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ina first for about 10 minutes of comments about Iraqi politics. Then we'll go to Renad, and then John and I will take over. So with that, Ina, the floor is yours. Oh, and last reminder, my apologies, just make sure to use that chat function to ask as many questions as you would like, because we do like to have as much audience participation as possible, even though we are all in a virtual space. So with that, Ina, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Erin and FPRI and DT for providing us with this platform to discuss the Hashd, a very controversial and very interesting actor within the Iraqi security landscape. So before we dive deeper into the more strategic questions of the Hashd, of the popular mobilization, I would like to start with a brief outline of the more recent developments. Now, 2 days ago, we witnessed some very powerful rhetoric when the Iraqi Prime Minister paid a visit to the headquarters of the PMF. And during this meeting, he described them, he referred to them as the apple of Iraq's eye. So for those who haven't followed closely the video footage, I would like to summarize a bit the key content. Al-Khadimi mainly reaffirms that the Hashd constitutes an official state-endorsed agency. He stressed that the PMF are part of the armed forces, that they are needed to uphold the national defense infrastructure. So he also honored their military contribution to the fight against ISIS, and he paid respect to their sacrifices on the battlefield. But he also reminded them of the legal framework. And as I am a bit of a fan of conducting narrative analysis, I would like to draw your attention to exactly how he did that. Instead of focusing on crime and punishment, Khadimi went for the carrots approach. He focused on the added value of the Hashd Shabi law from 2016. He basically told them that the Hashd law is the one mechanism that would guarantee the hard-won privileges for Hashd fighters and for their families. So complying with the law would help preserve the prestige of the organization as one being at the forefront of the fight against ISIS. He built this whole narrative around the idea of a shared cause, of a common enemy, an enemy that should not be allowed to sow disruption and chaos in Iraq. And he also casually reminded them of having frequented this room where the meeting was taking place while he served as the head of the Iraqi National Intelligence. So more importantly, he declared his full support for the PMF. He vowed to provide them with everything they needed to protect the nation. And here I would like to underline two important aspects. Khadimi knew how to deploy cultural symbolism. So he reiterated a shared Iraqi identity. He built a common reference to the sons of Ibrahim, and he also even compared the sacrifices of Hashd fighters to the heroism in the Gilgamesh Epics. He compared their deeds to those of early Islamic warriors. And he also did not miss the opportunity to reiterate the religious legitimacy of the organization, that emanating from the fatwa to defend Iraq issued by the Grand Ayatollah Sistani in 2014. This reference was also meant to stress the role of the Marja'iyya Diniya, the supreme religious authorities in Iraq, as a moral compass. And in the words of Khadimi, it was an institution, an authority that did not differentiate, did not discriminate among Iraqis. So according to the Prime Minister, the PMF belonged and should belong to all of Iraq. And reading between the lines of the sentence, we also see an appeal to the leaders of the Hashd to help him to take on initiative to clear the image of the organization from the well-known accusations of sect-coded violence, of human rights violations. So basically, he said, as long as the PMF remained committed to improving on the self-discipline fronts, he, in his role as commander-in-chief, would do everything within his power to protect the assets of the Hashd from external attacks. And this trade-off was placed at the core of his message. He underlined also that Iraq was not owned by anyone, and he declared his commitment to Iraqi sovereignty. Now, I would like us to take a step back and think a bit about the rationale of the troublemakers, of the so-called resistance factions. And we can see that this vow by al-Khadimi to protect the Hashd, to take on this responsibility seriously, to fight off encroachments upon Iraqi sovereignty, was clearly engaging with their main point of criticism. And here I would like also to quote some statements from interviews which I conducted in Iraq with commanders of some of the resistance factions. Now they say, the state does not accept any opposition to the US. The US exerts pressure upon the Iraqi government. It is the duty of the Iraqi government to advocate for the cause of the PMF, to protect it from attacks. And last but not least, the Iraqi government should stop American trespasses. Right now, they claimed we see Israeli airplanes coming to Iraq with American cover. So as we can see in these quotes, this alleged disregard by the US of the official chain of command has so far empowered the narrative of resistance factions. And they are the ones who argue against compliance with the state's regulatory framework. The Prime Minister appeared to understand, to comprehend these stakes. And in my view, he extended a hand to those factions which, for pragmatic or strategic reasons, did not want to put at risk their own relationship or a mutually beneficial relationship with the host bureaucracy. As for Iraq's US allies, the Prime Minister made very clear that it should be Iraq first and that it's Iraq's responsibility to police its own forces, to contain the influence of rogue elements. And to conclude, I would like also to mention that during the meeting, we saw commanders from the so-called Shrine Brigades. Now, end of April, they had announced that they want to pursue a separate path away from the Hashd Shabi Commission. By bringing them to the table, sitting opposite of Abu Fadak, who is Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis' successor as chief of staff of the Popular Mobilization, and whose appointment they had previously rejected, the Prime Minister sought to convey a message of unity. And so far, it may be a more optimistic view, but we haven't seen yet resistance factions trying to spoil this message or these endeavors. As sort of predicted in the chapter, which I hope you would now end up reading, I was suggesting, or I was arguing, that the prospect of alienating further factions, further constitutive elements of the PMF would eventually sensitize these resistance-leaning elements that possess a lot of power, a lot of leverage within the Hashd to the side effects of disintegration. And once again, to connect to the chapter of mobilization after Muhandis, this was one of the main strengths, the virtuosity of the engineer, of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. He knew how to navigate privileges, rights, patronage networks, still among the usual suspects, but without pushing other elements which were less opportune to a point of no return. With him gone, the PMF is left with Abu Fadak, who is a battle-hardened profile. He's a cadre of Katab Hezbollah, one of the most powerful, most enigmatic formations that demands the full withdrawal of US forces. So it raises the question, how will he leverage his influence among these resistance circles? I would suggest that he has the opportunity to build on his image or his reputation as a mujahid, to curb the resistance activities or the illicit resistance operations of those units. The problem is that the majority of their supporters they are convinced that there has to be a presence outside of the official chain of command. So we are left in a very tricky situation where the chief of staff has to exert a lot of pressure on those formations, and failing to do so would put at risk this relationship or this gesture of goodwill, which we saw with the prime minister, especially if the Hashd ends up condoning or somehow allowing for resistance operations or for attacks on foreign assets to spoil the upcoming strategic dialogue between Iraq and the US. And here I would end it.
Thank you, Ina. And for people interested in the chapter, I put it in the chat box. And Renad, over to you.
Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you to Erin and John for the opportunity to take part in this very sort of important project. The title is Iraq in Transition, and of course with transition I had to think about what is it transitioning to, what is Iraq transitioning from, is Iraq in a kind of purgatory? Should we just understand where it is now rather than where it's going? But I understand that this idea of Iraq in transition sort of came out really at a time in sort of post-ISIS, where you had another sort of mission accomplished, where the US, international coalitions, and the Iraqi government had won another military battle. And so the question that we were asking at that point was, is there enough now politically, economically, to actually tackle the roots of ISIS, right? The roots of conflict. And I think that's where this project comes in. The chapters that we're addressing in this project are really not how do you blow up ISIS, how do you bomb ISIS, but how do you make sure ISIS doesn't just keep coming back in this like sort of cyclical nature that is post-2003 Iraq. And so where are we now? And what I'll do is I'll give a sort of in my presentation, and I promise I'll try my best to stick to 10 minutes, but I'll talk about a bit about Mustafa al-Khadimi's government. I'll look at where the protesters are, I'll look at where the leaders are, and then sort of what role does the US, do international actors have in all that, of course, with the strategic dialogues coming up. As Ina mentioned, as Americans are saying, everything is on the table. So let's discuss what is on the table to some extent as well. So I think the best way to understand Iraqi politics now is a massive crisis of public authority. Really, those post-2003 Iraqi leaders are unable to try and maintain some kind of constituency, some kind of base, what they used to call the silent majority. Fringe protests aside, they're really unable to maintain a base. Since 2003, Iraqi leaders rely on sort of several different tools to try and maintain this base. The first was this ideological tool. And this could be different types of ideas. This could be this ethnic sectarianism that you've seen in the past. This could also be the democracy language and the anti-Ba'athist, anti-Saddam language, as well as the anti-corruption language. So they would deploy these kind of tools in a way to try and win over support. What we've seen in the last few years is no one is buying that anymore. Many Iraqis are not buying that if you're a poor Shia, that someone like Muqtada al-Sadr can use Shiism or anti-Americanism as he once used to. Across the country, you're seeing this. I just use one example, but you can do the same with all Iraqi leaders. The second sort of way that Iraqi leaders sought to maintain this kind of patronage since 2003 is through economics, right? So what you've seen is the public sector expand massively, 10, 20-fold from 2000 to today. They're giving jobs out, right? You have a problem, you give out jobs, people will go home and be happy. What we've seen with the economic crisis that Iraq is in and heading towards, they're just unable to give out jobs. Those protesters that we're seeing in the squares across the country are from outside, or they're a younger generation who don't remember anything before 2003. And so the final kind of tool that leaders use is coercion, right? To some extent, to bring down civil society and those voices against them, they would use violence. Whereas they used to use a mix of these three things, today they're over-relying on one, and that is coercion. They did so in 2011, when Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was faced with protests. No one talks about these protests in Basra and Baghdad then, because he was able to use those three. But there was somewhere else that he didn't use the three, but he only used coercion, and that was in the Sunni, predominantly Sunni provinces, where you have ISIS coming out of a reaction to protests that turned into violence. And so the point I'm trying to make here is, if the elite will continue to rely on coercion and violence, it will lead to more violence, and that to me is the fundamental destabilizing factor in Iraqi politics moving forward. So where does Mustafa al-Khadimi come into all of this? Iraq has a new prime minister. I last spoke to him in February, but I've known him for many years, and I'm sure many people watching have known him from the years of the 90s, and also since 2003 from his days as a journalist and then in the government. Mustafa al-Khadimi is not a revolutionary that's going to change the system, and he's also not a strong man who's going to try and sort of move towards a coup d'etat or towards some kind of centralized system. Although one would think about former intelligence chief becoming president of or prime minister of a country in a very strongman term, I think that's a bit, we need to step back from that. Mustafa al-Khadimi's plan, when you speak to his advisors, when you speak to him, is incremental reform. It's to play by the rules of the system, to give the parties what they want, but try and slowly build towards some kind of reform, and that's his game, right? So if you look at what he's done so far, I mean, we can't be too hard on him, but let's just look at his cabinet. I think if you look at his government, you have three different types of characters in sort of the ministers that he's already gotten approved. The first type are these independent technocrats who are, you know, sort of the Minister of Interior, Defense, and others, who have had to reach an understanding with some of the political parties that own those ministries. So the political parties of Iraq own each one of these ministries. What Mustafa al-Khadimi did was he wanted to choose the leaders, but he got them to go and reach deals. So you have some ministers who are independent, they've reached understandings. You have a second set of ministers who have instead reached deals with the parties. And you have a final set of ministers who are actually director generals who have, for some of them, for over a decade, been in that ministry, acting as a proxy for the political party that they represent. So if you want to map out the ministry, really what you're seeing to a large extent is the same old game in that case. However, he wants to reach out to the protesters. And what he's doing is trying to come up with ideas like electoral reform, early elections, and holding to account those who killed protesters in the last year as a way to reach out. So how is it working? And this is the second point. How are the protesters reacting to Mustafa al-Khadimi? I think most protesters in Iraq, and most Iraqis in general, are tired of hearing a leader who promises but doesn't act. Right? And so one of the things that we're hearing when we're speaking to protesters across the South is they're saying, okay, sure, Mr. Prime Minister, if you talk about early elections, give us a date. We're not just going to sit here and listen to you promise something, give us a date. If you're going to talk about holding to account those that killed protesters, set up a committee and put people in jail. Mustafa al-Khadimi is asking for a grace period. He's asking for a period to allow him to pursue his incremental reform. The protesters at the moment don't have an issue with him. A lot of them know him as almost an ally while he was intelligence chief and allowing civil society to be maintained, but they won't give him that much. So that is what we should look out for, the time difference in how much the incrementalist needs to pursue reform and how much space the protesters would want to give. Within that, you also have a political elite. And to some extent, the political system has managed to weather a massive crisis to get to a prime minister who's another compromise candidate, similar to when Nouri al-Maliki became prime minister, similar to when Haider al-Abadi became prime minister, and to some extent when Adil Abdel Mahdi. So the system, the stakeholders in the system have come back together and they've agreed on a weak compromise prime minister who can present a nice face to sort of subdue some of those concerns. But of course, we know those political parties are massively fractured. So political party leaders are unable to get their own to toe the party line. So when, you know, for example, the Hashid, which Inna was talking about, they have a political party known as Fatah. That's their electoral bloc. But within Fatah, you have different parties. You have Badr organization, you have Asab al-Haq, and then you have Sanad as a bloc. Most people within Fatah who I'm talking to are angry with their leaders to some extent, especially with Badr. So you have a lot of internal fighting because what's happened in Iraq since 2003 is you have newcomers who've come in and each are making a claim for that slice of the pie. So that slice of the pie has become smaller and smaller every year. And we're at a point right now where internal rivalries are more important than the kind of external rivalries that we've seen. So how does Mustafa reform? He has different ways he can go. Let's go back to the previous prime ministers who came in and what they did. If you look at what Nouri al-Maliki did, facing the exact same structure, which is all of these different ministries that are controlled by political parties, Maliki decided, I should centralize everything. And he made the PMO, the Prime Minister's Office, a very strong institution in its own right. He created the commander-in-chief role. He brought in the national security advisors. He brought in all these armed groups and really centralized power within the PMO. And that allowed Maliki in his sort of reign to be able to pursue his agenda. Abadi then comes in 2014 and does something a bit different. He actually allows the game to continue, just like Maliki did at the ministerial level. He allows the politics to continue, but he also brings in a few advisors and sets up a sort of parallel system where reform, he's moving towards some reform within a parallel system to the PMO and the ministers. Then you have Adel Abdel Mahdi. Adel Abdel Mahdi basically gave up the PMO. He gave up the PMO. He allowed the parties to then also infiltrate into the PMO and into his chief advisor positions, and even to some extent his chief of staff. So what you're left with is a PMO, a ministry, and politics in general, as well as a judiciary that is entirely politicized, not independent or able to function. So the advice, and from the conversations that we've been having with Mustafa, sort of the Prime Minister's team, the first step to reform is how do you strengthen the PMO? The PMO has a lot of power. If as an institution, it could be strengthened, it could hold to account some of those political parties. Can Mustafa, what to look out for? Can the Prime Minister choose his own team? Can he choose his own advisors? Can he pursue this kind of incrementalist reform that he's looking to do? Because even when you talk about the Hashd and what to do with the future of security sector in Iraq and the popular mobilization units in Iraq, they technically fall under the PMO, under the National Security Council, which falls under the PMO, right? So if Mustafa is able to establish a team of advisors and officials that he trusts in the PMO, he'll have to push back against some of the problems that Adel Abdel Mahdi did to the institution. And that's how you move towards security sector reform. Not bombing them, not sanctioning them, or not any kind of kinetic force against these militias, but holding them to account. And the second thing the PM has that's important is the power of the purse. Iraq might become illiquid and potentially even insolvent in some time in the coming years, which means that all of those salaries that they've been using to maintain patronage will go away. Then someone has to decide with what's left of the money, where does it go? And the work that we've done on the Hashd, when we look at the economics, a large chunk of the Hashd's revenue come from the central government. And so is there a power of purse function there to accompany the sort of accountability? To conclude, what's the role of the US in all this? I think it was a very sort of good point made earlier, which was to say that the US doesn't necessarily always drive Iraqi politics, but neither does Iran. Oftentimes these external actors are weathering themselves different storms and trying to ride out the waves rather than making the waves. I think that Iran had to, some extent, allow for Mustafa al-Khadimi to become prime minister. Keep in mind, Iran accuses Mustafa al-Khadimi of being complicit in the killing of Qasem Soleimani in January. So within the span of a few months, for Iran to go from there to there, I think shows that they're trying to navigate what is the complexity of Iraqi politics. For the US, for any international sort of organizations or let's say external actors in countries that are invested in Iraq or working in Iraq, the key has to be how do you build those strong institutions, those state institutions that could hold to account. The key cannot be any kind of kinetic action that is short term and leads to sort of results that are unpredictable in the medium to longer term. So that to me would be sort of some guidance and guidelines to this upcoming strategic dialogues, as well as any sort of foreign sort of intervention and looking for another mission accomplished in Iraq.
Thank you, Renad. As I said at the outset, two very interesting presentations. We are right on time. I'm going to turn over to John, my co-moderator here, for a few minutes of moderated discussion. And I have 2 questions already in the chat box. We will get to those. But if people have more questions, please do feel free to type them in there, and we'll get to them. So John, over to you. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Erin. And first off, thanks to FPRI for engaging in this partnership with the DT Institute. This is our first partnership like this, and we hope to do a lot more where we're highlighting opportunities through good research to make an impact, both on the policy level, but also in specific areas of peace and conflict around the world. So Iraq in transition, I think, Renad, your paper was really timely. One of the things that delayed the publishing of this paper was that the Iraqi political dynamic was so volatile that we couldn't exactly find a good time to publish because it was always, changing. Now, it feels like we're in a position with a new prime minister where there's a level of expectation set so low that perhaps he can exceed them. And my question, to tee this up back to Renad, is it appears that the prime minister has taken his appointment as a mandate and is acting with clarity of purpose, which perhaps is surprising and even troubling to some. His appointees include Ali Alawi in the finance ministry, now interim in oil. He acted quickly to reinstate General al-Sadi for the counterterrorism force, and is become seen, he's actually inspired a bit of questioning, is he going to emerge into a strongman role? I think you addressed this a bit in your opening comments, but could you talk a little bit about how he is building that cabinet, that prime minister's office, how he can stay on track because he doesn't have a natural political constituency, and really move towards the endorsement in a larger format election coming within the next year and a half. So he started off somewhat assertively, but the question is, how does he manage that minefield to stay on track?
Thanks, John. I think you're asking sort of the right questions, and sort of that's the questions we're asking him and his team as well. How do you maintain this momentum? Again, he's not the first new prime minister to come up and with these kind of sweeping reforms and suggest something different. Nouri al-Maliki renamed his coalition State of Law when he began, and then we saw where that ended up. That's not to suggest al-Khadimi is going that way. It's a hard question because he's kind of, you're right, he's getting 2 messages. One is very clearly he hasn't competed in the election. He has never been a political appointee. He's never been part of a political party, and somehow he's ended up being prime minister. So to some extent, a lot of Iraqis are saying, well, we didn't really vote for him. We didn't vote for his party. He's there to kind of weather the system and move it towards an early election, to kind of deal with the mess that's happened from the previous prime minister. Yet when you look at his government program, he wants to typically fix it all. And in a very Iraqi manner, he wants to set up all these new committees and all these councils to come up and do investigations. And so how do you move from that to very clear and concise programs? I would think, and I think his team is suggesting, that the key has to be, do you get to an early election? But of course, there's a lot of complications with early elections. First of all, there needs to be an electoral law that changes the game. And that electoral law hasn't even been passed to some extent. There's still debate on that. And so when do we get the electoral law out? There's also a political party law that I know his team is focusing on. This political party law is important because one of the keys to that law is that militias, armed groups can also compete in elections. So Iraq and Khadimi have this sort of, let's say, legal and institutional frameworks to be able to push through some of these reforms, but he just needs to make up his mind. Is he going to fight all of corruption and get rid of all the political parties, or can he just get to an early election with a different electoral law? But he's also faced with this America issue and the strategic dialogues and renegotiating that relationship that he will sort of pursue. when I was talking to sort of people trying to understand the type of characters that he was going for, I think you've mentioned, you're spot on it. He's looking to develop a set of allies within his administration, people like Saidi, bringing him back to the CTS, working with like the new Minister of Interior, al-Khadimi, these kind of professional, almost general-like, well, they are generals, military type of actors. And if he could put some of them into these positions to try and present some kind of authority, he has an opportunity now, and this is important, that Iraq, the way the economy is going, its response to coronavirus, this is when you think outside the box. This is when you can try things. This is when business is not being done as usual. And so the question is whether he'll be able to maintain the momentum, because you know, doing things like reinstating the CTS commander and those, they're very short term, but he needs to really set that long term strategy. And so I completely agree that, you know, the clarity of purpose is something that we need to look out for. Some protesters are giving him 30 days. Muqtada al-Sadr has come out and said we give him 100 days. But the time frame is very short, where he will transform himself from promise to villain of many Iraqis.
So as a follow-up, the strategic framework discussions that are coming up, how should the United States approach these conversations with their Iraqi partner, given that they have a Iraqi prime minister who appears to take his role in a very serious fashion and wants to build this momentum? What should the U.S.'s how should the U.S. react to these recent changes, and how should they set their goals and objectives coming into these discussions?
I think to a large part, the strategic sort of dialogues that the U.S. have been pursuing is a consequence of his Mustafa al-Khadimi's predecessor, Adil Abdul Mahdi, and the fact that he basically gave up so many senior positions to different groups that are linked to militias, armed groups, and others. And so when you speak to American officials, I began to notice in a very troubling way that the government of Iraq was even on the table. There was officials who were even saying, not only are we going after the militias, but if Iraq continues to support these militias, Iraq will also be an antagonistic government. And so Mustafa al-Khadimi's task, therefore, is to try and rebuild some of that trust, not him personally to the US, but that there are institutions in the Iraqi state that could sort of push back against accountability. Of course, this is all in the context of the strikes against Qasem Soleimani, the killings of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Mustafa al-Khadimi has good relations with the US, with the UK, with European countries, with the Gulf, Saudi Arabian. He's been pivotal in those over the last few years. He'll bring back a lot of people from the Abadi administration who developed those relations to some extent. So I would see that, you know, in a way, America, sort of the US is happy to move along with someone like Mustafa al-Khadimi very clearly, if he could begin to push back against some of those groups that have become very powerful in the last few years. We'll have to wait and see. I don't realistically think that there will be a massive change between American and Iraqi relations. I don't think that everything is on the table. I think that's more of a bargaining and negotiation tool. But keep in mind, we're in Iraq again in 2020, and the US and Iran both had to come together and agree on the same person for prime minister.
Let me jump in here. I just want to let the speakers know, and John know as well, is that we have 7 questions coming in. And so I want to turn to Ina now with sort of my own question, and I want to loop in one of the questions that we got from the audience, which is, I mean, one, you know, you talked about the Hashid or the PMF. I was hoping that you could expand a little bit and, you know, how they plug into Iraqi politics. You know, Renad talked a little bit about the efforts to try and let's say, defang some of the militias that try to exert themselves politically through the force of arms and perhaps their own patronage networks. So perhaps you could go a little bit into that. And then just because I think it dovetails nicely with one of the questions from the audience from FPRI's own Mike Noonan, which is what has been the tactical and operational impact of the killing of Muhandis? Has this, you know, impacted the effectiveness of the Shia militia, of Shia militias in Iraq broadly, and then linked to my own question about how they fit into Iraqi politics?
Okay, thank you. So to begin with, your first question about their participation or infiltration of Iraq's political scene, it has always been a very contentious issue, them contesting the ballot box. For example, on the one hand, they still do rely on the legitimacy, on the endorsements by the Shiite religious authority. And when they announced their intent to participate in the 2018 elections, the Marja'iyya has openly criticized the politicization of the institution. So they were very much aware of the risks. They were acknowledging this window of opportunity that the Hashid used to build a political campaign about the battlefield legitimacy. Tahaluf al-Fatah, it already is a reference to their conquest, to their military contribution to the fight against ISIS. And this was something that was seen as very controversial, not only by the Shiite religious authorities, but also by leaders or commanders from the so-called shrine brigades. After the elections, after the results of the elections, which benefited the Fatah alliance, we saw some sobering, and voices within the Hashid were evaluating critically this participation in the political field. Because at the end, they acknowledge that it's a dirty game. It's connected also to a lot of challenges. It's very difficult to perform on the governance front. And some of the more critical respondents to my questions have been very candid in their criticism of the decision to enter politics. Now, on the other hand, entering politics has unlocked a lot of access to decision-making powers, to institutional leverage. There has been very little written, unfortunately, on the economic empowerment by the Hashid from the state. There has been excellent work by Chatham House and Renad's report on the illicit economy, but this state-endorsed economic empowerment has not been very much covered. And for an example, we have witnessed even some state-owned enterprises being sort of placed under the authority or at disposition of the PMF. Now, regarding the internal competition within the PMF and this internal disagreements as of whether we keep one foot in the political scene, I would like to connect this with your second question and to bring it to the profile of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. He had this legitimacy, this credibility as sort of a unique figure, and he had immense influence in politics, even though he steered away from the corridors of the parliament. So when I interviewed him shortly before the Iraqi elections, he made it very clear that he was annoyed by this preoccupation of Hashid leaders with political campaigning. He was very strong on the necessity to divide, to discern the political arm from the military, from the security mandate. And I think we are facing now a very difficult moment. The Hashd al-Shabi is sort of confronted with an identity crisis once Muhandis is gone. Because on one hand, his legitimacy, his legacy as a fighter, as a mujahid, gave him just enough credibility to preach to the less convinced factions the benefits of state institutionalization, the benefits of preserving a minimum level of compliance with the formal chain of command. Now it remains to be seen whether Abu Fadak is going to stick to this plan, to stick to this vision. But he was also instrumental when it came to forging alliances with less likely formations, with less likely segments of society that were more skeptical of the PMF. As I have outlined in a report for the Century Foundation, he had immense success in reaching out to Sunni communities, and he was also respected among tribal mobilization forces. So in that sense, the assassination has weakened the PMF on that front. We can only speculate to which extent the new leadership, or let's say the new power dynamics within the Hashd Shabi Commission, are going to pay attention to that front, are going to invest effort, but also like to make the necessary concessions to keep all elements happy and content and on track. But I would not go as far as to ascribe superpowers to him. We should remain open, also to consider what kind of profile Abu Fadak is bringing to the organization, and how his leverage vis-a-vis resistance factions can be used to curb their enthusiasm for a war of attrition, for example, with the US.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Ina. Sorry, we're trying to field as many questions as possible coming in. And, you know, so Renad, I wanted to turn over to you as well for a follow-up. And it comes from the audience as well as, you know, to what extent is the Prime Minister's independence from any political party, is it a disadvantage for him, you know, and perhaps to Maliki, who obviously comes from Iraqi Shia politics, and who had a base of support, you know, that he could draw upon, even if controversially. And it's, you know, the question, the reason I'm picking it out here is because it dovetails on one of the ones that I had teed up for you, is if he is an sort of, as you describe, an incremental reformer, you know, how incremental can he be? So if he's not radical, and I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but, you know, knowing you and, you know, knowing Iraq not nearly as well as the panelists, but, you know, having been a few times, there is need of maybe large scale change, or at least an effort to bite off a lot. How does he square this? And what are these challenges?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. And believe me, I'm with you on this, on what type of change is needed and what type of change they're trying to pursue. Look, he's a man of the system, you know. I mean, he was made by the system and he's lived in the system. And look at, even when he was head of intelligence, he took over the intelligence, you know, agency within the PMO in 2014, and he kind of internally fixed it to some extent, cleaned it, made it an effective force, but he didn't change the whole thing, right? When the Iraqi state was killing protesters, he knew that was happening. He didn't resign. He didn't have an ideological kind of thing to say, I cannot be part of this government. But what he tried to do was to work from inside to try and bring about that kind of incremental reform. So if you speak to some civil society Iraqi activists, during the Maliki years, many of them had to flee, especially in sort of 2012, 13, 14. During Mustafa al-Khadimi's reign as intelligence head, many of them felt that they had a bit more openness to have free speech in Iraq. So Iraq always scores miserably in all sorts of governance accountability, sort of, let's say, rankings. But one of the things that it does a little bit better than in many countries in the region is that free speech, right? So for example, in the last few years, I have given even more critical talks of Iraqi leaders from Baghdad, in Basra. I've been to sort of Mosul, Anbar, and Kurdistan. So you do have that free speech. And I'm not saying he's sort of responsible for all of it, but I think he did have, to some extent, he tried to play that role. And so what I'm trying to say is that's how he thinks, right? So if you look at the Iraqi state right now, you have a president who is a sort of, let's say, who views himself as a sort of liberal, reform-minded with the protesters. And you have a prime minister who views himself as liberal, reform-minded, and with the protesters. The two most powerful, technically, formal institutions of the Iraqi state are in the hands of two sort of, let's say, liberals. And if you look at some of the pushback, so for example, a few months ago, the Hashd groups wanted to nominate the governor of Basra to be prime minister, and the president basically pushed back and said no, right? Moving away from that kind of just ceremonial role and trying to push back. However, the question is whether those kind of very small changes is what Iraq needs. And this goes back to the sort of, I think, the heart of your question, which is probably not. The Iraqi system is not sustainable. As I've been saying, the elite are less able to really rely on either economic rewards, you know, or ideological sort of gains. And so the social contract is being completely renegotiated to that extent. And the Hashid fall into this, right? I mean, the Hashid, sure, they were weakened by the killing of Qasim Soleimani, al-Mahdi Muhandis, but they were becoming weak for a long time, just like every other party. So the challenge I have for this new prime minister is, will he be willing to stick his head out, sort of stick his neck out, and really pursue some of that change? Will he actually go after those responsible for killing protesters? Will he actually try and bring about the political party law or enforce it and change the electoral law? Those are the big questions. And at the moment, you know, until we see action, it's hard to believe an incremental reformist could fix the mess that is in Iraq.
Yeah, let me take the next one, Erin. You know, there's some questions in there which are very good. Please keep them coming. I think you know, one of our concerns was that we may be too detailed and too in a narrow topic, but we're finding a great deal of questions here. So there's a couple of questions that are thematically around the PMF. How are they funded? And what is the impact of the change from Muhandis to Abu Fadak? And so I think this comes for both of you right on. And it also goes into the strategic framework negotiations question. On the other side of this, the Iranians are watching the evolution of how al-Khadimi plays the PMF constituencies. The funding for the PMF constituencies, you talked about that. A lot of that comes from the state revenues. And therefore, as they shrink, it becomes more of a battle. But how do the PMFs receive funding? How does this evolve in an environment where the oil market has crashed and we're reordering the patronage system? How does this emerge given Muhandis's demise and Abu Fadak's rise? And how do the Iranians react to what is their evolving pieces on the chessboard? So that's a lot, but there's a whole bunch of questions around this. So I try to synthesize them into something a little more cohesive and together. But really, to both of you, if you can get into that aspect of it.
So to start with, once again, how the killings have impacted the strength of the PMF. There have been a lot of internal disagreements, and I remember in the first period following the assassination, when a bunch of resistance veterans came together, some analysts were maybe a bit too prematurely concluding a rapprochement that was supposed to be sustainable, but it wasn't the case. So this could not really dilute or distract from both ideological but also strategic and tactical disagreements, even within the so-called Iran-aligned camp. So there we see a lot of nuances when it comes to the popular narrative of resistance. I would even refer to it as an oligopoly on resistance, because currently there is no consensus on the trade-off between, on the one hand, pursuing a transnational resistance agenda, and on the other hand, preserving this level of compliance with the state's regulatory framework. As Renad also mentioned when he spoke about state revenues, this was to a large extent the carrot that was used by al-Khadimi in his last visit, in his address to the Hashid leadership. So to conclude on that part, the killings have rather aggravated already pre-existing trends. And also I would like to address the question by Tenasi on the split off by the shrine brigades. Their discontent with favoritism is not something new, right? So for example, Maisam Zaidi, one of the commanders, had been raising the issue of loyalty-based discrimination within the Hashd Shabi Commission since like maybe 2016 or even earlier. So during the succession debate, or the so-called succession crisis before the inauguration of Abu Fada, they were very vocal regarding their discontent, regarding the way things were managed. So it was very much focused on the governance, on the administrative dimension of the Hashd Shabi Commission. I would say that this gamble was not taken seriously by the likes of Abu Fadak. Also, their statement, which they released shortly after his appointment, claiming that they have been neither informed nor in any way included in the choosing of Mohandas' successor, was completely neglected. So a powerful moment in this relationship, or in this rift, was also meeting with the representative of Ayatollah Sistani, Ahmad Safi, who addressed the issue of favoritism within the PMF. And I think this is something that the new leadership would have to tackle, because there are a lot of those factions that were maybe less entitled during the reign of Abu Mahdi, and that now they feel that the time has come for the cards to be reshuffled. And also like to connect to one of the points, these internal disagreements, these rifts, contestation over resources at the federal level is also reflected and reproduced within the context of the Hashd Shabi. Even within the same factions, sometimes we see contestation. For example, there have been interesting power dynamics within the Badr Brigade, and also disagreements between Hadi al-Amri and Qasim al-Araji. And we should be very careful not to put them into currents defined as homogeneous, and to pay attention to the nuances. Please remind me aspects that I have still not addressed.
That's great. You want to go, Renad? Would you like to take any follow up on that?
Maybe about the
Sure,
funding too. Sorry, let me cut you
Okay.
off about the funding.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the way the funding is obviously the most contentious and important issue for these groups. I remember once I was, and I tell this story a lot, so I'm sure some of you probably heard it, but I'll say it just to get into the point, which was I was at a checkpoint hanging out with some of these commanders, and I noticed all these trucks. I noticed they're making so much money, so I asked him how much they're making, and he gave this astronomical figure, something like $300,000 a day, US dollars. And I was like, wow, that's so much. And then he looks at me and as if like I've just said something crazy. And he's like, you think that's a lot? We have one ministry now. We make 10 times more just controlling a ministry, right? And so the point of the Hashd funding is the point of every other political party's funding in Iraq, which is you need to have one hand in the state somehow. Internally, the way it works is you have the commission that was created in 2014 by Nouri al-Maliki as ISIS took over Mosul. The commission then has all of these different brigades and numbers. Each one of these brigades has what's known as the person who is in charge of finances. He then sends to the commission the names of their fighters as well as the name of their martyrs and asks the commission to pay them based on those names. And you have 50 or so brigades. Then the commission, in this case it was Abu Mahdi and some others, will decide which names get paid, which groups get paid, and which groups do not get paid. So when we began doing this work, I was working with Falih Abdul Jabbar in 2015. We went around, what we found out was that a lot of the, let's say, groups that are closer to Iran had no issue getting sort of paid, what Ina's talking about. Whereas those groups that were, let's say, closer to Sistani or even Muqtada's people used to tell us, they're not getting paid as much, or they're not getting their names, right? So it's a huge internal struggle where the money goes. And of course, the key was always money for the Hajj. To some extent, that's why they managed in last year's budget to get even more pay, so that they get paid effectively the same as all armed groups in Iraq. And just to make a point here, so you have what's the formal payment, which is of course what every political party does, which is paying those who are under the commission, but then you also have the informality, right? So to go back to my original story, the way politics works in Iraq is you don't necessarily need to have a minister anymore, but if you have a director general in a ministry that you control, that director general can then go to their minister and say, you see this contract that's come in? That contract has to go this way. And if that minister tries to say no, that's when the big guys get involved. And this is, by the way, just to stress, not something unique to al-Hajj al-Sha'bi. This is just how politics as designed by the democratizing Americans works in Iraq.
Erin, before we go over, just as a point, the participants, we have another half an hour of the speaker's time. So as long as everybody wants to stay on, we're on. But Erin, you were going to pose the next question, I think.
Yeah, and again, we're doing our best. We're getting a lot of very detailed and high-level questions, so thank you for that. I mean, we're doing our best, John and I, to try and synthesize them and get as many as possible within the time frame allocated. So, combining a whole bunch of themes, what should be done by the Iraqi government to avoid the unwanted ramifications of the conflict between the U.S. and Iran? One of the FPRI board members, Don Carden, was asking, along this lines, expanding on the impact or lack of impact of the death of Soleimani and the sort of reverberations and conflict with Iran on Iraq, and then building on that, what should be done to de-escalate the tension between the U.S. and Iran, and how do you, both of you, Renad and Ina, see the upcoming discussion between Iraq and the U.S. about the troop withdrawal in June? This builds on another set of questions we've had about the pressure the Prime Minister is under after the killing of Muhandis and Soleimani. To withdraw the okay for the deployment of U.S. forces. So I mean, Ina or Renad, you can pick that up, and we'll do our best to get to everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, so to begin with, the probability of further escalation and of let's say armed groups spoiling the upcoming strategic dialogue, and also in reference to the decision for withdrawal of US forces. In an interview that I conducted with Abu Ala from Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada, he interestingly implied the readiness of the group to disarm or to delegate their military equipment to the state to comply with the military chain of command in a scenario where the US withdraws, because in his perspective, this was seen as the will of the people. Now, if the strategic dialogue with the US succeeds in reaching an agreement where it's upon the invitation of the Iraqi people, of the Iraqi government, for US forces to stay, it would be more difficult for them to wage this narrative of occupation forces, of US overstepping its mandate in Iraq. So what the Iraqi government can and should do right now is to continue on the course that al-Khadimi already is paving, to protect Iraqi sovereignty and to deprive them of this argument to position themselves as protectors of Iraqi sovereignty, which paradoxically are somehow outside of the military chain of command. So this is my point on that front.
Renad? And
yeah.
And then somebody did also ask you to sort of expand upon how Sadr, fits into the strategic dialogue as well.
Just as a footnote.
As a footnote, I want to make your life more difficult than it is. You're getting too comfortable over there.
Yeah, listen, I think it's interesting to go back to, you know, how the US came back in the first place. And of course, it was Prime Minister al-Abadi who wanted US air support, but also wanted to kind of push back against what he was seeing as increasing Iranian influence through the armed groups and militias in 2014, 15, 16. And so he thought, after the Battle of Tikrit, when he was fighting ISIS, let's get the Americans back involved. And the Americans' air power has been important for ISIS, for combating ISIS continuously. As we've discussed, ISIS is still sort of present. And in fact, what we're seeing in the work that we're doing on the sort of informal economy and the trading routes is that you're seeing much more competition over those routes as the groups lose money from the cities because people just don't have cash anymore. Restaurants aren't open, so the traditional forms of making money on the side don't work. You're going to have more and more competition, and ISIS is already, as many have been talking about, making moves in that regard. So, look, I'm not sure, how, to be honest, how much to make out of the US-Iraq strategic dialogue. I know it's been sort of, it kind of comes in a series of events, in a series of antagonisms and escalations, with the climax probably being in early January with the killing of Qasem Soleimani. Both Iran and the US, I would still think, would not want Iraq to turn into a pariah state, let's say. Iran actually benefits from having Iraq as a lifeline into the other countries, into the West, into the US. And so, and as I say, they've often been on the same page. They both wanted Maliki to be prime minister. They both were okay with Abadi, and they're both on this. So we'll have to see how much comes out of this, and sort of whether everything is on the table is a negotiation. The other on Muqtada, as we saw, he kind of, after the killing of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, was making a play. And in the chapter that I wrote with Ben, who probably is the sort of, has been working on the Sadrist movement and as one of the most prominent scholars, at least in the last few years, definitely, we kind of looked at sort of where Muqtada's people are. And the crisis of public authority that I talked about, again, it's not just the Hashid, it's not just all the elite, but it's also Muqtada Sadr. Right? So he came out and tried to revive some of that anti-Americanism, right? And he tried to call for this million-man march, even talking about the 1920 Iraqi revolution, and this is kind of the next revolution. And it didn't really work. He wasn't able to. And then he tried to even get his people to go and flush out the protesters, because the idea was that it's the Sadrists who are protesting. And then even that didn't work. So he's also at a loss. To some extent, he's facing the same problems that Iraqi leaders and parties are all facing. And so how does he regain some of that ideological power? How does he regain some of that economic power? Or will he also have to look towards more coercive mechanisms? We know that the Sadrist movement is fragmented. It's a person under a kind of network, a network that has some clerics, some of whom have already come out against Muqtada, a network of civil society and political activists, some of whom have come out against him, and also an armed group. And he has several, he has 2 or 3 militias inside or armed groups inside the PMF, as we've been talking about. So the fragmentation, I think, has really hurt the Sadrist movement to some extent. And moving forward, I would just say that he faces the same challenges that all political parties face. Keep in mind that although he has positioned himself as a supporter of independent technocrats and as a supporter of reform in Iraq, the Sadrist movement is has one of the highest counts of director generals and state employees who serve as proxies, and several of these ministers have long relations. The new ministers, I mean, have long been working as proxies in the ministries that they're now ministers of for the Sadrist movement.
So Renad, just to carry on with this, I mean, first off, as a comment, I think the evolution of Muqtada Sadr into a political, the political force that he is now in Iraq has been interesting to have watched, going back to his father's assassination and the credibility that he represents. So he's a force to be reckoned with in Iraqi politics now and in the future. And the Iranians as well have got to feel a little bit of that there's a threat here, that their constituents in the PMF are now being divided. And as the strategic framework conversation comes up, what do you see the Sadrists doing short term, if anything, to influence those negotiations? And the same with the Iranians. How do you see the Iranians will work to shape those negotiations so that they can come out? Would there be the potential that they take some sort of attack or something to drive the U.S. and Iraqis further apart as they go into these negotiations? So that's the question. I think it's a short-term tactical question, but I think it ties into the longer-term strategic flow of Iraqi politics.
I think anyone, as yourself and others who have been following Iraq for long, would probably have had many nights lost from a lack of sleep, from trying to understand, or as we try to do in this chapter, make sense of the Sadrists. And yeah, you know, I mean, I've spoken to some senior government officials who have said that actually behind closed doors, Muqtada has been an ally in pushing towards reform and pushing against the Iran infiltration. And then sometimes you see from his public messaging, you get that, you know, sometimes he's against Iran and sometimes he's with Iran. We know that since the protests erupted in October 2019, he spent most of his time in Iran. His people are saying that he is looking to gain clerical training, because that's always been one of the issues, is how his authority clerically is often questioned. But of course, he also has serious trouble with certain Hashid groups. His rivalry, particularly with Asa'ab al-Haq, oftentimes you get street battles still continuing these days. So you have massive conflict back and forth between him and some other groups. And it was someone like Abu Mahdi who was to some extent allowed to control that, and Iran was allowed to control that. But Iran would use that in a way to say, if you know, Mr. Sadr, if you're going to piss us off right now, we can take back that and we can get these guys to come after you. And they try to use that as a way of intimidating. So moving forward, then I would say that Muqtada is, you know, his movement, a lot of people within his movement are reform-minded. A lot of people within his movement, although openly don't want to meet with Americans and want America to go out, they also are primarily concerned with Iran's infiltration of their country. And that's important as you meet Sadrists across the country. It's the Sadrists that were really one of the first to begin chanting Iran out in the streets years ago. So that's there too. So so I suppose what they want is just no countries to interfere in whether it's America, and they were very anti-occupation, or Iran now. Iran has an interesting role, just for the second part of your question. So Iran, I think it's well known now that Iran's hope was somehow for Adil Abdul Mahdi to continue as this weird acting, resigned, non-resigned, quasi-prime minister, and business to continue on the side as usual, right? But that circus was unable to maintain itself in the end. You had two prime ministers who failed to form a cabinet designates, and then finally, with the economic crash that's coming, with Iran's own domestic issues, it just could not afford Iraq to continue to be a circus. And it had to, you know, to some extent, as I say, make a compromise. Mustafa al-Khadimi was vetoed for a long time by Iran, who accused him of being complicit in killing their general. So for them to now have to agree to someone like him to be prime minister means that they're recalculating and rejigging their sort of their navigation of Iraqi politics and trying to move forward. As I say, I don't think, I mean, the Iranians want American troops out. I don't think Iranians want Iraq to turn into the type of pariah state that does not have international engagement or is an actor on the international scene, largely because Iran benefits from having Iraq as an economy, as a consuming economy, as well as a lifeline and a link to the region.
Yeah, I want to jump in here and ask a few questions, combine a few questions, I should say, linked to something that you just mentioned, Renad, and I'll come to you for the first crack at it. you know, if we're projecting forward, you know, will al-Khadimi have enough room to maneuver in order to engage with, you know, internal protesters who, you know, despite the quarantines in Iraq or quarantines around the world, maintain interested in pushing for governmental reforms. And something that I can't remember which one of you mentioned, I think it was you, Renad, in your opening, which is this push for legislative reform to be able to organize early elections. And then another question combined and linked on to that is, what mechanisms will Khadimi have, or what avenues will he pursue to try and get reelected? I mean, because all politicians want to stay in power. And because something we talked about earlier, he doesn't come from a particularly strong political bloc, or doesn't have a lineage within Iraqi from a Iraqi political party, will he try to set up his own bloc? Will he try to create his own constituency? So I mean, do you want to take the first crack at that? And then we'll come to Renad. And I am mindful of time. I think this may be the last questions that we have, and maybe we'll do a 2-minute wrap up after that. So over to you.
So I mean, Khadimi, at least for now, from the first signs, seems to be keen on walking the talk. There has been immediate action taken in Basra against the group Tar Allah, which ended up implicating in the injuring of protesters. So he's already addressing in his first steps the issue of accountability, like who was responsible for those killings. There is an investigative committee on that. And also, I think he, in his speech or like in his addresses to some of the responsible individuals, he made a very interesting point on the street legitimacy, or let's say on the popular currency. When he spoke about the prestige of the Hashd al-Sha'bi, the way I read this between the lines was also meant to remind them that their grassroots DNA, their image as protector of the nation, would be at risk if further incidents, or let's say more unfortunate episodes, are being reported of them exercising coercion. But another problem of that coercive exercise or experiment was that in a lot of cases, in the context of Iraq, as Renad mentioned, those responsibilities to exercise coercion, to establish control, are very much being delegated by ruling elites. So we see a lot of hybrid experiences of delegating authority to auxiliaries. And that to a large extent means state elites, but also such para-state formations or hybrid formations, sharing the burden and the benefit of preserving the status quo at all costs. And Khadimi has a long way to go there, but he seems so far up for a long run. And he has also like started with some very concrete actions on that front.
Right. I think I just want to pick up, because I think Ina's like absolutely right in the challenges that Mustafa faces. Look, I think I just don't think that any of the Iraqi elite understand these protesters. There is this idea that Iraqi leaders can somehow buy out the protesters or reach out to them with promises. These protesters aren't a single movement. They're not even really, a lot of them, political in themselves. They're just kids and people hanging out in tents because they have no other way to have a voice. And so in the past, there was a different game, which was political parties would go and give jobs and this and that kind of worked. And in the past, there was also groups like the Quran movement that showed up in 2009-10 in Slaymaniyah, which is a protest movement taken out of a political party. Or there is Sa'irun, which is a protest sort of party taken out of a bit of Sajrist, a very little bit of communists and that. These protesters are, to that extent, less top-down and less political. It's a society. And so to really address the protesters, I don't think it's in the nature to just go to the streets and make promises to them. It has to be to look at their demands and how can you actually address the demands of what they're saying. And I think that's why they're saying, don't send us your envoys, don't send us these treats, don't send us these niceties, give us a date. That's what they're saying. You talk about early elections, give us a date. And so these protesters, a much younger, a much more radical group of Iraqis who we're speaking to and civil society are beyond the sort of top-down protests that you saw in previous iterations of that. And I think, as Ina says, the violence factor is huge, because if you look at where protests end up in Iraq, the most peaceful outcomes have been when there has been some kind of compromise reached. The worst examples of where protest outcomes end up is when violence is used, and that leads to more violence. And so accountability is key on Mustafa al-Khadimi's premiership if he's really able to bring together that. And so what I would look out for, and what I would sort of point everyone to, is you now have a Minister of Interior, Uthman al-Ghanimi, a very celebrated Iraqi general, who's taken over the top of the ministry from the Badr organization. How did he become minister? What kind of understanding does he have? Because he has to have an understanding with the Badr organization to become minister. What is he allowed to touch and what is he not allowed to touch? Is he allowed to touch the rapid response forces that the protesters accuse that are within the Ministry of Interior? Is he allowed to touch the federal police? And so those are the real clues that protesters who I'm speaking to are looking out for, to really think, to kind of put meat to the words that they're hearing in another prime minister who's promising the world to them. On the final issue of elections, Iraqi elections are defined by patronage networks, because most Iraqis don't vote. They would rather go to the streets and protest than vote because they don't think voting actually matters. And the way that the electoral system was set up, it's driven by these political parties who don't even, they don't even have kind of regional representation where they know who they're voting for oftentimes. The lists have increasingly been open, but it's still a very unclear mess. And so traditionally the groups that win are those that have enough people on the payroll in their camps to be able to go out and mobilize votes. A majority of Iraqis do not vote. Keep in mind that in Basra, the voter turnout in 2018 was less than 20%. And in many parts of Iraq, the turnout was low, particularly where you have protests. The question of can Kadhimi win? He's never been part of a political party, really. He's never competed in elections. I think given the current structure, he might face the same fate that Haider al-Abadi did, the prime minister who had won the fight against ISIS, who was using the war as a way to kind of create a victory coalition, and he ends up losing to who? To the political parties that actually have patronage networks across the system, because he did not. So the only real way that Kadhimi could win is if he somehow manages to mobilize the protesters and the silent majority, because keep in mind that not everyone in the south in Baghdad are on those protest squares, but if he's able to mobilize a large segment of society that themselves don't see eye to eye, to come together to vote for him in some kind of populist mandate. But at the moment, he has really little control of the political parties, and his enemies are in control of the judiciary and other groups, other institutions in the Iraqi state that would really try and bring him down.
Well, I want to thank everybody, in particular Ina and Renad, for I thought was an extremely in-depth and fascinating discussion. And it, I always like to joke, as somebody who follows Iraqi politics, but not nearly at the level of probably John, definitely not of Ina and Renad. I always learn something from these panels, and I learned a lot from being the convener and the editor of the edited volume that's now on the FPRI website. And for that, I really do want to thank DT Institute. It was a collaboration the entire way from its inception, I guess about a year ago, John, to its almost completion. We have one more chapter coming, but that's not been published. So thank you, everybody. And I want to thank everybody for attending. And I want to make a plug for FPRI. FPRI subsists itself on our members. And if you are new to FPRI, you can go to fpri.org. On the far right of the webpage, you'll see a little tab that says support, and underneath it says donate. And I think I'm going to also give a plug for DT Institute, which is, dt/global.com. John, do I have that right?
No, it's dt-institute.org. But,
sorry, DT Institute.
Yeah.
There
And
we go.
we're happy to support FPRI as a grantee. These are the types of partnerships we love because we can bring great people together and young up and coming thought leaders like Erin and invest in them to make an impact. That's the goal.
I appreciate that. And so thank you, everybody, and have a good rest. I think, Ina, you're in Berlin. Renad, you're in London, correct?
Yeah, I'm in London.
Yeah, so you two have a nice evening. John, you're in Chicago. Have a nice early morning or good early afternoon. And I have lunch to make for 2 children under 5.
And
so
thanks to everybody for sticking with us. A great conversation. I have to say, I'm always a glass half full person when it comes to Iraq. And I think there was a lot of good things that came out about the potential here. And yeah, it's great to hear the contribution. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and have a good rest of your day.